Well, good evening and welcome to our weeds, the control and prevention class. I'm David Rice, and we've got Addie M. Fassel joining us as well from Weaver Basin, and Sheridan Hansen from USU Extension tonight. So we're excited to have her instruct us and share her knowledge and skills with us. So before we get started, just some of you may be a little bit new to this format with us. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but we'll just want to review just a couple of things. Maybe first, let me just give a little introduction to the district. Weaver Basin, we're the regional water supplier for Davis, Weber, Morgan, and Summit counties. And we provide wholesale drinking water to the cities, and then agriculture and irrigation, secondary irrigation water to residential and other uses. It's to a population of about 700,000 people. And as you have heard, there's a statewide drought. It's a statewide drought declaration. The water supply this year, there's water storage. It's not going to be a drinking water scarcity by any means, but there's certainly going to be some issues with irrigation this year if we don't see an increase in some precipitation. So we would like to ask all of you to be very aware of that. Of course, weeds kind of contribute to that. If you can eliminate your weeds, they're not using any of that water resources out of the soil and some of that. So this class does tie into that very well. So the format, if you're not familiar with this, we encourage your questions. We want the dialogue. The Q&A control button that you have on your controls, if you'll just type your questions into that, then we can address those questions, or Sheridan can answer those along the way, just depending. So with that, Sheridan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I will stop sharing my screen. You can take over control and share, and just, if you'd like, give an introduction to yourself and take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's see. Let me just get sharing my screen here. Okay, so like David said, my name is Sheridan Hansen, and I am thrilled to be here tonight talking to you about weeds, how to control and to prevent them. It's one of the biggest questions that we get asked in my area where I work, which is horticulture with USU Extension. I'm located at the USU Botanical Center in Kaysville, right across from the Kaysville Ponds. If you haven't come to visit us, I strongly encourage you to come and visit. There's walking trails, many gardens for you to see. We have I think it's 7 acres now. It keeps growing, 7-acre arboretum with over 400 trees for you to look at and explore and see. And we also have, demonstration gardens like an edible garden, an urban farm, all of these different things for you to come and see. So please come out and visit us. We would love to have you. And like David said, weed control really ties into water, which is an interesting concept that maybe you haven't really thought about before. Weeds compete with our wanted plants for resources, and that includes water, fertility, access to soil, all of these things our weeds can compete with. So without further ado, let's hop in to weeds. I encourage you to ask questions. I'm happy to take your questions, and David can interrupt me at any time. And if we have a question that's relevant to what we're talking about. So please do type in those questions. What we're going to be covering tonight, what is the definition of a weed? Why are weeds so difficult to control? We're going to talk about different means of spread, how they live, so that you really understand how they move around and why they make our lives so difficult. We have 100 acres at the Botanical Center, and let me tell you how difficult it is to control the weeds. It is so hard. So then we're going to move into how to control them. So we're going to work on helping you understand different types of weeds, how easy it is to control. I'm going to give you some tips on how to win the weed war. And then we're going to talk a little bit about common weeds and how to beat those. So you should be very well versed in weeds by the time we finish tonight.
Sheridan, let me jump in really quick. I forgot to mention, this class is going to be recorded. It'll be posted on our website afterwards. So if you feel frantic, like you missed a slide or something, you can always go back and review these later. I forgot to mention that. So sorry, Sheridan, go ahead.
No, you are perfect. And that's always a great thing. We've been teaching a lot of virtual classes the last year. And we found that people really love the option of going back and being able to rewatch something that maybe they don't understand. So that's a great option. I'm glad that you bumped in there and told everyone that. So don't panic. And I'm going to go pretty slow so that you have an opportunity to ask questions, and so we don't skim over things too much. So what is a weed? There are many definitions of a weed. One is a plant out of place. Any plant that is in a place where you don't want it is considered a weed. An undesirable plant. Sometimes we have things come up in our yard. We didn't plant that. What is it? It could be something that isn't necessarily, you know, what we would consider like a dandelion or field bindweed, but it's not what we want in that place. So it's an undesirable plant. An interfering plant. So this is what David was kind of referencing, is a plant that is interfering with the uptake of nutrients and resources in our desirable plants. So weeds can be interfering. I love this one. This is by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said that weeds are a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. Maybe we just haven't given these plants enough of a chance, or maybe we've given them too much of a chance. I'm not exactly convinced on that. And we can look at it as a plant that has mastered every survival skill except for how to grow in rows. So they just are unruly. They're difficult for us to control, and we really don't like them. A plant that someone will spend time and money to kill. We spend a lot of effort, a lot of money, especially in the agriculture industry and horticulture, trying to control weeds and kill them. So we spend a lot of resources on this. The official definition of a weed is any plant that interferes with the management objectives for a given area of land at a given point in time. So if my objective for a piece of ground is to be a vegetable garden, and I have field bindweed popping up, or I have white top or one of these other weeds popping up, it's interfering with what I wanted that land to be used for. So that is my official definition of a weed. As you know, weeds are incredible survivors. They have learned to adapt, and they have learned to make the most of their environment so that they can survive. They are excellent reproducers, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how they reproduce. They grow really fast. In fact, a lot of the times they will outcompete just by growing faster our plants that are desirable. If you've ever had a lawn, and in that lawn you have like orchard fescue, orchard grass that comes up in that lawn, you know that it grows a lot faster than your regular lawn, and you'll get these weird long patches. Quackgrass does the same thing, these big long patches of grass that are outgrowing your regular Kentucky bluegrass. They are hardy generalists. And when I say generalists, it means that they can live in a lot of different environments. They have adapted themselves to live in many places, by the side of the road, in your vegetable garden, in your turf. They have learned to live wherever they can. So they have multiple ways of spreading. And this is one of the things that has made weeds so successful. They usually don't just spread by one method. The seeds that you're looking at right here are seeds from field bindweed, which we often call or refer to as morning glory. And these seeds remain viable in the soil for over 50 years. So if you allow morning glory to go to seed, you've not just created a problem for yourself, but maybe 2 generations down the line, your grandchildren that may be living there will see the seeds come to fruition of the bindweed that you left for them. A lot of the times they'll also produce copious amounts of seeds. So they won't just produce a few seeds, they'll produce hundreds and hundreds and thousands of seeds per plant. Purslane is one that I deal with frequently. We get secondary irrigation. We love Weber Basin water, but we tend to get some purslane seeds from the secondary irrigation. And they're very, very small. They're difficult to filter out, and you have to have really, really tight filters, very small openings, and it just isn't feasible. So that's why it comes through the secondary water, and we just deal with massive amounts of seeds. And if I let those go to flower, the purslane that comes up, I will be dealing with purslane for a very long time. they can spread not just by producing seeds, but they can also spread by other means. So they will produce what are called runners or rhizomes or stolons. And this is basically a stem or a piece of a root that extends the plant. So this is Bermuda grass that you can see here on the screen. And this Bermuda grass has extended itself with a stolon. So stolons are above ground. Rhizomes are made from roots below the ground. I always think of stolon starts with S so it can see the sky. That's how I kind of remember it. But either way, it's this stem that extends along the top of the soil or through your grass. And a lot of our turf species spread this exact same way. Things like Kentucky bluegrass will send out stolons and rhizomes. But you'll see it spread this way. And then on each node, so a node is where I would have a leaf come out of the stem. And you can see the nodes here on the screen. And on each node, a new plant can form, and you can see that there are new roots starting to form. So not only is Bermuda grass going to give me seeds, it's also going to spread and create new plants that can live independently at each of these nodes along this stolon. They have also adapted to being spread in very creative ways. So you can see this poor little pooch, this poor little dog. He has been into a weed patch, and the weeds stick to their fur. So this is called hound's tongue. This is the type of weed that it is. And it's called hound's tongue because it has this sticky, these kind of like little prongs on the surface of the seed, and they stick to whatever animal comes and brushes by them. So they have learned and adapted so that they can spread easily. So a cow that comes moving along, a raccoon, a dog, a deer, whatever comes along, they can stick and they can move and they can spread. They can be spread by wind. We all know this with kids and dandelions. They pick those and blow them and make a beautiful dandelion field in your front lawn. Birds, deer, lizards, all can ingest plants and then spread through their digestion. They'll actually poop out those seeds in a different location, and the seeds have adapted to be able to be digestible. And then wheels of cars and bikes and the bottoms of your shoes are other ways that things get spread. If you've ever walked through a patch of, sometimes we call it goat head or puncture vine, if you've ever walked through a patch of that, you know that you can pick things up that way and move them along as well. So yeah, somebody asked, is that the same as the goat head weed? So puncture vine is the same as the goat head weed. So we need to kind of understand not just how they're spread, but how they live and how their life cycles work, these different types of weeds, because it will determine how we treat weeds. So we have annual plants, biennial plants, and perennial plants, and I'm going to tell you the difference between the three. An annual is a plant that performs its entire life cycle. So it starts from seed, grows a plant, sets a flower, and puts out new seed in a single year. So when we look at the life cycle of annual weeds, we have this gap during the winter where we don't have plants growing, but we have seed that has been produced and dispersed, and that is what is going to bridge the gap from one generation to the next. So a full life cycle in 1 year from seed to seed. Annual weeds only spread by seed for the most part. So these are things like spurge. Here's my friend purslane here in the image there. Crabgrass, mallow, pigweed, knotweed, henbit. Knowing this, knowing that they are only spread by seed, I have to keep these plants from going to seed. It will really reduce my seed load in the soil. And in my planting beds and in my turf, if I can keep these plants from going to seed, I have really done a great job in helping to win the weed war. Summer annuals, so there's a difference between summer annuals and winter annuals. So summer annuals are those that emerge as the soil warms in the spring. These are things like crabgrass. So crabgrass will germinate in April, May as the soil starts to warm. And we'll start to see little small plants of crabgrass develop. They'll continue to grow throughout the summer, and then they'll be killed by the frost in the late fall. This is where pre-emergents come into handy. We know that crabgrass germinates as the soil warms. So if we can get a pre-emergent down and keep our germination from becoming a real plant, what happens with pre-emergence is it creates a chemical barrier on top of the soil. And that chemical barrier will allow the seeds to germinate, but then they are quickly killed by that chemical barrier. So they don't ever take root and continue to grow. So knowing this, getting a pre-emergent down in April is really important to help me with my crabgrass control. That's going to stop the plant from growing, stop the plant from producing seed because it's not going to be growing, and that's going to help me. So crabgrass, I mentioned, knotweed, and spurge are all examples of summer annuals. Winter annuals are a little bit different, and it's because they like a little bit different temperature. They germinate and emerge in the late summer or early fall. They can sometimes overwinter through the winter. They'll sit under the snow, and in the early spring, they will finish their life cycle, and then they will die back in the summer. So we don't see them so much in the summer. A lot of the mustard family ends up being in this category, winter annuals. We have shepherd's purse here in this photo. So if you've ever seen this weed early in the spring, this is shepherd's purse, and it's called that because it has these little purses where the seeds are forming on the plant. Chickweed, blue mustard, these are all winter annuals. And the difference is just the timing of the year and the temperatures that they like. So now a biennial is a little bit different, where annuals go from seed to seed and complete their life cycle in a single year, 365 days or less. The biennials need 2 years to complete that cycle. So what happens in the first year is they produce a rosette of leafy growth. So you'll see this at, low on the ground. You'll start to see leaves, and they go kind of in a circle pattern. That's what we call a rosette. And then that will overwinter. And then the second year, they will produce a stem with a flower on it, and then they will produce seed. And all of this is followed by the death of the entire plant. So these live for 2 years. Biennial weeds tend to spread by seed. Sometimes they have, there's always an outlier, somebody who needs to be different, but they also have deep tap roots. So we tend to find when we dig up these plants, this very long, deep tap root. This helps to stabilize the plant. It helps them reach nutrition deep in the soil. It helps them reach water deep in the soil. And it is a survival method for these type of weeds. Examples are Queen Anne's lace, which I showed you here, burdock, and mullein. So mullein we often see on the sides of roads, and we'll have these yellow flowers. A lot of the times the leaves are kind of thick and hairy. Oh, Michelle is asking, what is a good brand of pre-emergent, which I mentioned before. So things like Preen, there are a lot of different brands out there. What you just want is a pre-emergent that will give you some of that good coverage with our annual weeds. And I'm going to talk to you about the different chemicals as we get into this, so don't worry about that too much. So now we're moving on to perennial weeds. We talked about 1 year lifespan. We've talked about 2 year lifespan. Perennials persist for many growing seasons. In fact, they can pretty much live indefinitely as long as conditions are right and they have access to nutrition. Generally, the top portion of our plant will die back to the ground each winter, and it will regrow the following spring from the crown. Sometimes they can have woody stems and the whole top part of the plant won't die back, but it will lose its leaves, and then it will give a new flush of leaves in the early spring. So just like a shrub or a tree, it will do the same thing. The first year with perennials, they will work on establishing a root system and vegetative structure. So they will put on the leafy growth, they will put on stems, they'll create an extensive root system. And then the second and subsequent years, they will flower. So we won't usually see flowers the first year on perennials. But that can also be dependent on season length. Sometimes we actually make it to flowers, but not often. Perennial weeds tend to spread by multiple means. So these are the really tough ones to get rid of. So they will produce seeds, they will have runners, they will have roots that can break off and create new plants, or they will combine ways. So they will do the seed and they'll do the roots, or they'll do runners and they'll do seed. So they'll have more than one way of spreading. Now, there are simple perennials, things like dandelions, that only spread through seed, but they create a taproot and they can come back year after year after year. Plantain is the same way. But then we run into more complex perennials, and these are things like Canada thistle, field bindweed, which we often call morning glory, Bermuda grass, quackgrass, clover. There's a huge list. Black medic is another one, and the list can go on and on. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard about noxious weeds. It's a term that's kind of thrown around, but it is a plant that is designated by law as being undesirable and requiring control, which means if you have these weeds on your property, you are required by law to treat them. These are non-native and invasive plants that will compete with crops and other desirable plants for nutrients and can cause much larger problems if they are not treated. So we have a noxious weed list in Utah and Davis County. If you're in Davis County or Weber County, wherever you're joining from tonight, there is also a county noxious weed list. And the county noxious weed list can't be anything less than what the state says, but it can actually be more. They can add more weeds to the list. So you can find that list. It's pretty easy to find, even if you just type in Utah's noxious weed list into your Google search bar. This list will come up, and I can actually bring it up for you. Show you what this looks like. So this is the state of Utah's noxious weed list, and the weeds are categorized into different categories of how difficult they are to control, how invasive they are, and you know, there are things here that you may be familiar with. Dyer's woad is the plant that's up on the foothills that turns yellow every year. And everyone thinks it's so pretty, but it's incredibly invasive. In fact, I was up hiking and somebody was actually digging it up and transplanting it up in a canyon. And I waited for them to leave, and then I went and undid all of their work and unplanted everything that they had transplanted. And they had told me, it's so pretty, we just love seeing it, but it's actually on the noxious weed list. So there is a pretty intense list of weeds here that you can easily access and look at. Oops, I did it again. Hold on. Wait, that's a Britney Spears song. All right. We have a noxious weed field guide for Utah from USU Extension, and it is available online. You don't need to purchase a book, and that's what you're looking at here on this photo. And you can look up USU noxious weed field guide, and it will take you right to this field guide, and it can walk you through many of the weeds that we're going to talk about tonight. So it will give you the different classes, it will show you pictures. I think this one is much easier to look at, much more digestible than the list that the state gives you, because there's pictures, and of course we love pictures. So it will give you kind of identification cues, things to look for, you know, where these weeds are a problem, where you may find them. So that is something that might be of value to you as well. Here's some of Utah's noxious weeds. These are the ones that you may be most familiar with: Bermuda grass, or even more likely to encounter in your yards. So Bermuda grass, field bindweed, knapweeds, loosestrife, medusa head, quackgrass is one I get questions about all the time, leafy spurge, some of the thistles, and then of course that Dyer's woad that we spoke about. So when we talk about controlling weeds, we've got to understand the life cycle of our weed, how it spreads, how aggressive the plant is, and understanding all of this is going to help you treat the weeds effectively. And IPM practices should be implemented. And what I mean by IPM is integrated pest management. So a weed is essentially a pest. It's something that we don't want and we need to control. So when I talk about IPM practices, This means that we have thresholds. So I look out into my yard and maybe there's 1 or 2 weeds. That means I don't really need to spray. Maybe I can go out and pull them by hand. There are things that I can do without putting chemicals out into the environment. When a weed becomes problematic and I can no longer meet the needs by going out and weeding by hand or taking care of it by using some of these other methods of control like solarization, then maybe I need to look at upping my game and using a chemical control at that point. So what that means is we just assess and we take and treat according to what we feel like we can do at the moment. And we're very, very selective and very careful about when we put out chemicals. When we deal with chemicals, always follow the label directions. So people do not read the labels on chemicals. And I have to tell you, it is the most important thing. I'm going to show you a video of what happens when you don't read the label and don't follow the label on chemicals as we get into this. So some of the control methods, these are things that you can easily implement to make your life a little bit easier and help you start to battle the weeds. There are different ways to control. Not everything is a chemical. So this is where we're implementing that IPM. We start with the more simple things and we work our way up. So things like cultural controls, these are all organic controls. We can use mulch to smother out weeds. We can use what's called solarization. So solarization is where I take a clear piece of plastic and I place it over my vegetable garden area and I tack it down. And I'll do this maybe in April or May, and I let it sit there and heat up in the sun. So what happens is the sun puts out radiation, and underneath that plastic, it also has to have a little bit of moisture too. So make sure you put it down when the soil is a little wet. But underneath that plastic, we will trap the radiation and it will heat up to this just insane temperature where it just gets very, very hot, and it will kill and burn out all the weeds underneath that plastic. It's a great method of control if you're looking for an organic method. Plant competition is something that we can use. When we're not using our garden soil, we can plant something like a cover crop, and that competition will help reduce the weed pressure. Improving turf health. This is probably one of the greatest things you can do in your lawn. If your lawn looks like it needs some help it, because that will help you control the weeds. When we have a healthy, thick turf, it creates the same thing that I'm talking about with cover crops. We reduce the we increase the plant competition and reduce the likelihood of weeds being able to germinate and being able to reach sunlight and grow in our turf areas. So make sure you're aerating, make sure you're watering appropriately. We want to be watering deeply and infrequently to drive the roots down into the soil so that the plant has access to water and to nutrients that it wouldn't have if we were watering, say, every single day. We want to make sure that we spread out that watering. Weed barrier is another great one. We talked about this in the Master Gardener class that I am running right now today. We talked about getting down this weed barrier and why it's so important. And this is something that you can implement in flower beds and you can implement in vegetable gardens. It's very easy to put down, and it will reduce the weed pressure immensely.
Sheridan, there's a question about solarization and the heating, and how deep does that kill? Will it kill seeds and so forth?
Right. So yeah, it will help to germinate some of the seeds because initially it's warmer, and that will help to get the germination going. And then it will kill those as it starts to heat up. So you may see an initial flush of green underneath it, and it will kill. It will kill a few inches down into the soil. It's not going to kill, like field bindweed that is clear down in the soil, but it will definitely push it back and really weaken the plant. So good question. Other common control methods are things like mechanical controls. Again, this is organic. We're not using any chemicals. This is us going out into the garden and we're going to hand pull. We're going to till. We're going to cultivate. We're going to use a weed flamer. Be very careful with weed flamers. I love them, but if you are not careful, you can light things on fire so easily. I almost lit my neighbor's house on fire with one. And I'm a horticulturist and should know how to do this, but you know, it caught onto something that I didn't know that was dead, and it grew very quickly. So be careful with the flaming, but it is a great way to control. And flaming works really well on annual weeds. So they don't have an extensive root system. As they germinate and come up and they're very small, we just burn them off, and it's a one and done for our annual weeds that are germinating. Okay, so we talked a little bit about pre-emergent herbicides. Oh, let's see, Kelly has a question. Does the weed flamer only kill the top of the plant? Yes, so that's kind of what I was addressing there. It does not kill the root. So that's why it works well with annual plants that are just germinating and coming up, because they don't have an extensive root system. Okay. So when we talk about pre-emergent herbicides, this is a great thing to get down as a preventative. And we kind of talked about this a little bit. We usually use a granular formulation, something like Preen that you put down. It's usually watered in, and it creates that chemical barrier. So those seeds will germinate, they'll start to try and grow, and then they'll be knocked back by that chemical barrier. It usually gives us control for 60 to 90 days, depending on the product that you use. So this is where reading the label becomes really important. And it works well for annual weed control. It prevents perennial seed germination. So if you had any perennial seeds drop, it will prevent them from, it won't really prevent them from germinating, but it will prevent them from going past germination. This works well for lamb's quarters, crabgrass, purslane, spurge. If you're looking for an organic option, you can get corn gluten meal, and that acts as an organic pre-emergent. And I believe you can pick that up at some of the IFAs, health food stores, those types of places have it. So you may have to call around a little bit. So this does not affect, you know, extensive root systems, plants that are already established, but only plants that are germinating and coming up from seed this year. So then we have our post-emergent herbicides. This is when, you know, we can no longer control things other ways, and we have to get out, you know, our big chemical controls. These should be used selectively. So be very, very careful. Again, read the labels always, and make sure you're wearing your personal protective equipment. So if it tells you to please put on goggles and gloves and all those things, you should definitely put on goggles and gloves. All too often I see people spraying in shorts and flip-flops, and you should have closed-toed shoes, you should have pants on, long sleeve shirts, even if it's hot outside. So you can be spraying in the morning instead of in the heat of the day, and it's actually much better. When we talk about chemical controls, it breaks into two categories. We have selective chemicals, and these are chemicals that only kill specific weeds. We use these a lot in turf because a lot of the times they won't kill turf. They will only kill what we call broadleaf weeds. So anything that's not a grass is a broadleaf weed. Think about broad and round. That's our broadleaf. These are things like 2,4-D, triclopyr, MCPP, which is Mycoprop, MCPA, dicamba. All of these are broadleaf weed controls. With broadleaf weed controls, we have to be very careful with wind, and we also have to be very careful with temperatures. We want to make sure that we are not spreading these chemicals. So a lot of the times they can do what we call volatilize, and that is when our temperatures are above about 85, these chemicals can turn into a gas. They go from a liquid to a gas state, and they can drift, and they'll drift to the lowest point of a yard or your neighbor's yard. And like I said, I'm going to show you some photos or a video coming up here. And then wind can also be a factor. So you want to make sure when you spray that it's cool and that it's not windy. So early in the morning is the best time to spray. Now we have non-selective chemicals, and these are chemicals that do not select just our broadleaf weeds. They kill everything. So this is when we look at trying to kill a grassy type weed, we will use a non-selective chemical. This is stuff like glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. So Roundup is non-selective. It kills everything that it pretty much touches. Again, always read that label before application. Let's see, we have a question really quick. Once the chemical has dried, can it still volatilize when temperatures get high? Yes, it can. So you need to spray when the temperatures are consistently below 85 degrees. Okay, here are some chemicals that we commonly use to control weeds. This is the active ingredient. Here is the trade name. A lot of the times we refer to the active ingredient, and there are a lot more chemicals out there, a lot more herbicides. This is not a complete list. So these are just common ones that we usually run across with homeowners. So if we wanted to target broadleaf weeds, it's going to be a selective chemical, right? Because it's not going to kill grass. It's only going to kill broadleaves. And then we have these different active ingredients. So we have 2,4-D. We'll find that in products like Weed One and Turlon. Sometimes some of the formulations of Weed Be Gone will have a 2,4-D in it. But things to note is there are temperature restrictions on all of these broadleaf weed controls. There's our Mycoprop. That's in Weed Be Gone 2+2, and that one's made by Ortho. Dicamba. This is also called Trimec. This one has temperature restrictions. And one thing to note on dicamba is you need to avoid tree drip lines. So dicamba can very quickly kill trees and shrubs, any kind of woody plant. So if you are using it, be very careful around trees. And it will say all of this on the label. We've got 2,4-D. These are the 4-way products. So sometimes you'll find like Q4 Plus, 4-Speed XT will be one of them. Speed Zone is another one, and they're 4 ways. So when we say a 4-way product, that means it has 4 different active ingredients in this product. And those 4 different ingredients are going to be used to kill a weed in a different kind of way. So they all attack the weed's metabolism in a little bit different way. And this one has temperature restrictions again. Now, if we're just trying to kill grasses and we need a selective herbicide, we don't want to kill, so we've got grass coming up in our flower beds. There are very few options for this, but there is one out there. It's called Bayer Advanced Lawn. It has a chemical called MSMA in it, and it will kill grassy weeds in your lawn and in some of your other areas. Make sure you read the label on that. All right, here are the pre-emergents. We've got things like Dimension and Barricade, Yard Mastery. These will kill grassy broadleaf weeds. You get a season-long control with a lot of these. We've got trifluralin, which is the active ingredient in Preen. Stopper 2. Just be careful with your pets with Preen. It's something that can be a problem. And then with broadleaf weeds, we have things like Gallery and Galleria. That's a very common way to kill broadleaf weeds. That is a pre-emergent. And then we have our non-selective here at the bottom. This is glyphosate and Killzall. These are things that kill everything. So be very, very careful with those in that way. And this will be available for you, so don't freak out. You don't need to write all this down. It will be available for you. I did send over the PowerPoint presentation in PDF form, so you can pull this up and you can look at this list.
Sheridan, before you move on, maybe you're going to talk about this. There was a question a little earlier that I mentioned I'd just bring up about insect issues, any of these herbicides that may affect bees or anything like that. Are you going to talk about that, or is this a good point?
No, that's a great thing to talk about. So for the most part, these are not insecticides. These are herbicides, and they don't have a lot of bearing on our insects. When I start to use insecticides, that's when we run into problems. And there are a few fungicides out there that can be a problem, but for the most part, a lot of these herbicides, they target plant metabolisms. They don't target insect metabolisms. They work in a totally different way. If you are concerned about insects, make sure that if you are spraying, that you're not spraying near anything in full bloom. Watch the bees. You can spray at night when the bees have kind of gone back into their hives, and that will give you an opportunity to get this out and let it completely dry before the bees come out the next day. But for the most part, these types of chemicals there's no documented research that shows these really affecting our bees. All right, this is the video I was going to show you. So this is what happens when you don't pay attention to temperature and you don't pay attention to wind speed. So right next door to my house is a field that is owned by a water company. It's not Weber Basin. I need to clarify that very strongly because it really is not Weber Basin. And they have some noxious weeds in this open area. And so they hired a company to come out and spray. And the company came out on a day when we had wind speeds. I actually pulled up the wind speeds between 12 and 15 miles an hour, which is pretty intense for spraying weeds. And they also were spraying with a high pressure sprayer, which puts out very small droplet sizes, so like a mist. So you can imagine how that moved through the air. And then they sprayed when it was also, our temperatures were also high that day. So we were right around 85 that day. MSMA, does that kill Bermuda grass? Triclopyr and Terflon ester kills Bermuda grass. So that's the answer to that one. And we'll talk about that when we get to Bermuda grass. So here you go. This is my yard. So I lost the whole west side of my yard. And you can see the lot behind. Oh, uh-oh, there we go. Sorry. So it curled all of my oak tree leaves. It actually killed my oaks. And that's a honeysuckle. And the other one is, oh, I'm totally blanking out. My brain just stopped. This is Baptista. So Baptista, it usually should have stems that are straight up. Weed control affects the metabolism of the plant and causes it to kind of grow out of control. And when it grows out of control, you'll see what's called epinasty. So the plant will actually twist and turn. This is my tulip poplar. And it didn't affect the tulip poplar nearly as much, but we had some curling of leaves that actually dropped all of the leaves that were affected and put out new leaves. So you can see this curling of the youngest leaves. And this was about 2 days after it had been sprayed. So it hadn't been much time. There's another Baptista that should be sticking straight up, but instead it's curled. It didn't affect my 9 barks, so that was good. They seem to escape unscathed. And then I have another oak that it made it look chlorotic almost immediately and curled all the leaves and also killed the tree. So I had to deal with UDAF. They had to come out and do a bunch of tissue testing and tie the herbicide damage to the product that was used so they can pull all of the records from the company that sprayed, which they did. And then they pulled the wind speeds and they pulled all the temperature information, and then they compared that wind speed and wind direction to where it was sprayed, and it was 100% this company's fault. So it was great fun to call this company and tell them that they had killed all my plants. And they said, oh, well, how do you know that it was herbicide injury? And I said, well, I'm kind of the county horticulturist, the county professor in horticulture for USU Extension. And I think they about dropped the phone. So they really murdered my yard last year. So they were really good to work with, though. I mean, they replaced every plant. They replaced every plant in my yard that they had affected, which was very kind of them. And, things will be better this next year. And I have put up a wood fence to help with any future sprays. And the water company has promised me they will not spray. They will only mow from here on out. So 2,4-D and many broadleaf herbicides, like I said, should not be used above 80 or 85 degrees. Don't spray when it's windy, and certain plants are much more susceptible to drift. So oaks are definitely one. And then herbicides like dicamba, which I mentioned before, can move through the soil profile. So if you put them anywhere near a tree, you need to be extremely cautious. A lot of the times we get asked about home remedies. They're not always effective. People talk about spraying vinegar, and it is an organic control, but when you spray it on an organic farm, you have to completely suit up with a respirator and full body gear and gloves and boots and the whole works, because it is extremely toxic to your lungs when it is sprayed. I hear a lot about salt, soapy water, boiling water, all of these different types of things. And yeah, they may work, but the bottom line is these are chemicals. Vinegar is a chemical, salt is a chemical, if you look at the definition, but they're not labeled for weed control. And they can burn the tops of the plants. They'll burn the leafy green growth, but they won't get to the root of the problem with things like bindweed and some of our perennials that are very difficult to control. And they can cause additional problems. I mean, think about putting salt in your soil. That's what the Romans did so that people couldn't grow crops. So putting salt down into our soil is not a good option. So just be careful, think about it, do a lot of research if you're looking at using a home remedy. All right, 9 tips to winning the weed war. And then we're going to talk about some of these weeds specifically. And I know we have a question about bunchgrass, and I have a question for this person about bunchgrass. So number 1, change your mindset. I mean, pulling weeds can be a meditative practice. We can use it as a way to kind of ground ourselves and reconnect with nature. It can be a huge stress reliever. So change your mindset and look at it as an opportunity instead of a chore. Keep your supplies handy. If you keep your weeding tools together all in an easy to access place, it's going to make it much easier for you to grab your kit of weeding gear and get out into the garden and go working. If you have a spare minute, pull a few weeds. Taking on small sections of your yard at a time makes what seems like an overwhelming task much more manageable. So if you have a few minutes to spare, go out and weed just a little bit. And then weed throughout the season. This is one thing that I do. I schedule a time in my yard once a week to weed in my yard. And I will weed through it. And if I weed throughout the season, it makes my job so much easier. I don't have a huge uphill battle in front of me. I have just a little bit that I need to do once or twice a week instead of having to rally troops and do this overwhelming job. And we all know that weeding is never a one and done task. They keep coming back. Timing is key. If we can pull when the ground is kind of soft, so if you'll irrigate and then wait a day for the ground to kind of dry out just a little bit, it makes it so much easier to pull out those weeds. And then start with the right tools. Make sure that you have tools that are easy to work with, that don't hurt your back, that do the job quickly. So investing in a few tools will make this so much easier for you. And then enlist some help. This is one thing that I always do. I have 2 teenage boys. I grab those boys and bring them outside with me and we weed together. And it's a great opportunity for us to talk and to connect while we work together. You can also I really liked this idea, have a neighborhood round robin party. So this is where you go around your neighborhood with friends and you weed each other's yards. You make it social, you bring some treats. I know we're in the middle of COVID right now, so you would definitely socially distance and do this safely. But what a great way to get to know your neighbors, to talk, and to help each other. Keep your plantings healthy. If you will keep your turf, your flower beds, everything healthy, it will outcompete the weeds. And then call on chemicals when you need to. When the job becomes overwhelming, then we can turn to them and make sure that we're reading our directions and using them properly and wisely. So these are the top 13 common weeds that I typically get asked about that you may find in your yard. And somebody had a question about bunchgrass. And when you're saying bunchgrass, are you talking about grass that comes up in your grass? That's my question for you. So maybe if you can give me a little bit more information, we can get to your question. So here they are, the top 13 common weeds that we're going to talk about tonight. And you may recognize these. These may be your worst enemies, and I'm going to show you how to get rid of them. Number 1, the dandelion. We know that this is a simple herbaceous perennial, which means it comes back year after year, but it doesn't spread in other ways than just producing seeds. So that becomes an easy kind of aha moment. I don't want to let this plant go to seed. It does have a very deep taproot, which can be difficult to get out. And if I don't get out the whole crown of the plant, and that's where the top meets the root. If I don't get that crown out, this plant can grow back. So it's important for me to get it out And the best way to prevent dandelions, number one, is to keep your lawn healthy. If you will mow high, so we recommend in the summer mowing between 2.5 and 3 inches in height. So raise those lawnmowers in the summer. Not only will it help to keep that turf really lush and reduce sunlight down at the base of the turf where the soil is, it also helps to conserve water. So in a year where we are going to have some difficulty getting water for our lawns, make sure you mow high, and it will help also reduce this weed pressure. You can do mechanical removal, so hand pulling. This is where I take my little weed tool. They make tools just for dandelions that help to remove that taproot. And I can go out and I can sit there with my kids and I can hand pull and work my way through my, sections of my lawn. You can use a broadleaf weed killer. We recommend that you do this spring and fall because the temperatures in the summer are just too high. So make sure that if you have to turn to that broadleaf weed killer, that you are getting on it early in the spring or later in the fall when our temperatures are appropriate. I think we had some questions come in. What tools would I recommend? So I use what's called a scuffle hoe. That is one of my most favorite tools. There's also a tool by Wolfgarten that I like that you can switch the heads out on, and you can find the head that works best for you. So there are a couple of different tools there. I also keep, an arsenal of little hand tools. I have a bucket that I put my favorite tools in. So I'll have like a little shovel, any kind of 3-pronged rake that I love. I'll keep in my bucket. But for the most part, I use what's called a scuffle hoe or a hula hoe. Okay, so bunch grass, Lori says it's in her grass. And my guess is it's actually something like orchard fescue, which is a grass that spreads in bunches. It doesn't spread by runners so much, so it kind of stays in these little circles. And it can be difficult to get rid of. You have options. You can either dig it up and then put down some new seed or a piece of sod in that area, or you can spray it out with something like glyphosate, some kind of non-selective weed killer like glyphosate. All right, so there's dandelion. Okay, this one is the worst weed that has ever existed. This is field bindweed. Sometimes we call it morning glory. It is a perennial, but it has a few different ways of spreading. I showed you the seeds. The seeds are viable for up to 50 years. The roots put on rhizomes, and these rhizomes spread through the soil, and they can be 8 to 12 feet, sometimes even deeper in the soil. So every node on the root can become a new plant. This is one that if you have it in your garden area or somewhere where you want to till, you want to avoid tilling, because every piece of root can become a new plant. And when we take a tiller through it, we essentially chop up the roots and take one plant and make it into millions. So avoid that. So controls, if it's in your lawn, again, maintain a healthy lawn. Mulch does help. Using cover crops will help. Anything that you can do to shade it out, reduce the opportunity for the seeds to germinate is a great thing to do. Mechanical removal. So this is where I'm going to go out and I'm going to dig it out as much as I can. Solarization will help. It will knock back the top part of the plant and weaken the plant considerably. Chemical controls are often effective and will help you with something like field bindweed. We recommend getting down a Preemergent so that if you have any seeds that have dropped, that it keeps them from germinating. But Postemergents are probably going to be your biggest friend. And that's where we're going to take a broadleaf weed killer, something with the 2,4-D active ingredient or one of those 4-way products. And we're going to mix it with something like glyphosate. So we're going to take and we're going to use a selective weed killer with a non-selective weed killer. And we're going to double up and we're going to really pack a punch on this. The best time to control this is in the fall. We wait for a light frost. On the leaves of the plant is what's called the cuticle. And the cuticle is like this waxy covering. And if we can get a light frost, it will break down that waxy covering just a little bit. And then when we go to put our chemical on, it will be taken into the plant much easier. Also, because this is a perennial, it is taking nutrition in the fall time from the leaves and moving it down into the roots. So if I spray in the fall, it will take some of that chemical from the leaves and push it down into the roots and really help to weaken my plant. This is never a one and done. This is something that you have to stay on top of. You're going to apply multiple controls. Throughout the summer, one thing that I will do with this is I will take a shovel and I will just cut the top of the plant off over and over and over again. If it can't photosynthesize, it can't put nutrition down in the roots as well. So every method of control that I can think of, I will employ to help get rid of morning glory. Spotted spurge, this is a very prostrate plant. It's very low growing. It often grows in cracks and crevices. This is one that has very small seeds that often comes through secondary water. So you'll see it start to pop up in the summer. It's an annual. And it will spread by seed. It puts out a tremendous amount of seeds. It has these little tiny white flowers on it. And those flowers are capable of putting out quite a bit of seed. This is easy to control with hand pulling, with mulching. Mulching will help prevent seeds from germinating, so that's a great thing. Pre-emergent herbicides are also very effective against this weed. So get down those pre-emergents. And then you can also treat it with a post-emergent, but I don't typically treat it with a chemical spray unless I have it in mass numbers and it's just coming everywhere. It's very easy to pull out of the ground. So I'll often give my kids buckets and we all just take a section of yard and we pull and we place them in the bucket, and it's actually a pretty easy one to control. Let's see, I think, oh no, we don't have a question. Okay. Clover is one I often get asked about. Some people actually use clover as lawn. It can be difficult to get rid of. It is a cool season perennial, which means that it will do most of its active growing in the cooler parts of the year. So in spring and fall, and it will flower very early on. It spreads by seed. It can also put out a little bit of stolons above ground, but its main method of dispersal is seed. Hand pulling can help. Proper fertilization is actually extremely effective. These plants are in what are called like the legume family. They are able to fix nitrogen in the soil. So there's something about fertility with these, that if we increase the nitrogen, it reduces the need for this plant to be there, and it just doesn't germinate and it doesn't thrive as well as in low nitrogen environments. We want to keep our turf, again, very, very healthy. You'll hear me say that on almost every single weed that we talk about. And then post-emergent herbicides. This is effective. So this is where we're going to use a broadleaf weed control, something with that 2,4-D or MCPP is what we're going to use. Dicamba, triclopyr, all of those will work and are effective against clovers. Again, watch the temperature. This is something that you would take care of in the spring and in the fall. Common mallow. This is a very common weed. This one will produce the little cheesies. So sometimes you hear this called cheeseweed. And you know, if you were ever a kid in the 70s like me, 70s and 80s, you probably ate it. So, but that's okay. So this one can be kind of, depending on where you're located, it can be an annual, it can be a biennial, it can be a perennial. It just depends on your temperature and your microclimate and how it does in your area. It can spread by seed, and it has a wicked taproot. The taproot is incredibly long. So this is one of those that if we don't get out the crown of the plant, it will regrow. So we need a specialized tool like a dandelion tool that will help us to pull this out. So you can pull these out by hand. Mulch will help to prevent seeds from germinating again, healthy turf, and post-emergent herbicides. So this is a broadleaf weed. We would use a broadleaf selective herbicide. This is purslane. This is the one that I get every year in my secondary water. It's a kind of a succulent type plant, and it can be a little difficult to control because the leaves are thick and waxy. And so sometimes our post-emergent herbicides, our chemicals, don't work as well on this plant. But it is an annual, so it's easy to kill when it's young. You can go out and you can flame this one. You can use pre-emergence for this one. It really does help. The seed is produced 3 weeks after flowering, and it will flower, it will grow quickly in the heat, and it will flower, and it will produce seed very fast. So you can have a massive amount of seed stored in the soil if you allow this to go to seed. So hand pulling, mulching, flaming, those pre-emergents are important. Like I said, you can use the post-emergents, but they can be a little bit more difficult to be effective on this plant. You know, this is one that pops out of the soil very easily again. So, and you'll see these big rosettes form where it's a big round weed. And then there's one taproot right in the middle, and you can pull it right out. So if you can find that middle section and just pull it, it's not hard to remove by mechanical means.
There was a question about, is this the same purslane that's edible?
Yes, it is edible, but only if you're desperate. That's what I've decided. So you can eat it if you want. People say it's incredibly nutritious. You can put it in smoothies, that kind of thing. And people do put it in salads and smoothies, all of that stuff. So yes, you can eat it. But the back of my mind says why. But do whatever makes you happy. This is crabgrass. This is one that shows up later in the season. It likes warm temperatures. It typically starts to germinate right around now. So we are due for putting down our pre-emergence. It's an annual, and it will spread by seed. You'll see these little seed heads that look like fingers come off of the top of it. It's low growing, it's prostrate, which means it spreads out horizontally. And the best method of control is to keep that lawn healthy. Now, if you use an edger on the edge of your lawn up next to your sidewalk or wherever you have concrete, you'll notice that that is where the crabgrass tends to come from. And that's because even if we've put down a pre-emergent, it will come up there. And that's because we break that chemical barrier when we edge. So this is one that you could benefit from doing a second pre-emergent application, you know, a good 4 weeks, 6 weeks after your first application, and it will give you a little bit longer control. So if you struggle with this, look at doing 2 applications of the pre-emergent. You want to keep this mowed. You don't want to let this go to seed. So when we start to see those seed heads form and they look like 5 fingers coming out of the plant, that's a cue that we need to get this taken care of before this goes to seed. Quackgrass, this is one of those that outcompetes the lawn. So it will grow much faster than your lawn if you have it in your lawn. It's a cool season grass. It should say annual. I'm sorry, that's a cool season annual. It's a cool season grass. It will come up easily and it will grow much more rapidly. So you'll see it, and it can get 2-3 feet tall. It's a very tall grass, but it will spread by seed. It can also spread by some of these rhizomes. And you know, most grasses will have some kind of rhizominous growth habit where they spread a little bit you know, to the side, whether they're annuals or perennials. Again, keep your turf healthy. You can hand pull this one. Oh, I totally messed up the slide. I'm sorry. You want to hand pull this one. This is one where you can take, sometimes they call it a weed wand or a weed sponge or a wicking wand, and you can dip the wand, and you can find these at some of the places like Cal Ranch. You can dip the wand in something like Roundup, and you can, because it's taller, it grows taller than your regular Kentucky bluegrass. And before you mow, you would take that wand and you would run it over the top of this taller grass, trying not to hit, you know, your Kentucky bluegrass. Let it sit, let it be completely dry before you mow, and then you would go out and you could mow it, and that that chemical will be taken up by just the quackgrass and not your regular Kentucky bluegrass. So that is one thing that you can do that will help you. Persian speedwell is a summer or a winter annual. It just depends on your climate and where you're located. Here it tends to be a winter annual. So I've already seen this one out in bloom. It has these pretty little blue flowers. These notched leaves are kind of what I identify it by. And it spreads by seed. Again, healthy turf. These are very easy to hand pull. Mulch again will help. Pre-emergents, post-emergents. You're kind of getting the gist of this. I keep saying the same kind of chemical controls and cultural controls and mechanical controls over and over again. This is nightshade. This is spread by birds very frequently. They pick up the seeds, they eat them, and then they deposit them when they poop. And so you'll see this come up. It's kind of viney. It is related to a tomato, but it can be poisonous. So if you have this in your yard, you really should take care of it, especially if you have animals or kids. So there are two kinds. This is the hairy nightshade. It has the white flowers. And then the bittersweet nightshade I see more often. It has purple flowers, and the flowers have 5 leaves. And then you'll see these berries form, and the berries will turn red in the fall. It's a vine. It's a perennial vine. Tomatoes are vines too. And it's spread by seed. You'll want to hand pull this one if you can, but it can be difficult to get out. So a lot of the times we will spot treat the leaves with an herbicide, or we will cut the stems of the vine and we'll paint with a paintbrush, something like glyphosate or Roundup, right directly on where we cut, and that will help to kill the plant and kill the root. But this one can be a little bit tougher to get rid of. Puncture vine, this one is just the worst. Anyone that complains about stepping on Legos has never stepped on a puncture vine with their bare feet. They're awful. It's a summer annual. I get asked about this one a lot. It does come up in the summer. It is an annual. We have to keep it from going to seed is kind of the main thing to take away with this one. It's very easy to pull. So if you take a shovel and kind of go up under the plant, it will have one main attachment to the soil. And these plants can get 3 feet across. So you kind of have to take a shovel, try not to disturb the plant too much, get right up underneath it, and then you can cut that main root or you can pull it, whichever is easiest for you. And then you can very carefully put it in a garbage can or a bag or however you want to take care of it. But you don't want to let those seeds drop. When you see these little yellow flowers, it's a cue to you that you better get out there and get this taken care of, or we're going to have seeds forming. This one likes to be where compacted soils are. So reducing soil compaction is really important. And then wood sorrel or oxalis, we're almost done. I know we're out of time, but this one comes up in lawn very easily. I hear about this one a lot. It's a perennial. It can be very difficult to get rid of. It spreads by seed, and it will put out some runners as well. Again, keep your turf healthy. Pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides are incredibly important. We don't want to germinate more seeds. And then things like 2,4-D can definitely help with this one, but it's going to take repeat applications. It's difficult to control. And then thistles. Thistles are a biennial plant, which means, remember, they take 2 years to complete that life cycle. And they'll spread by seeds and they'll spread by rhizomes, depending on the type of thistle that you have. If you have one that is not a perennial, so this bottom one is Canada thistle, and it's a perennial, and it will spread by rhizomes. But this top one is like a bull thistle. And if you don't allow this one to go to seed and you don't allow it to flower, because it is a 2-year growth cycle, it will die back in 2 years, whether it flowers or not. So if you mow it, it's extremely effective. Where this one, the Canada thistle, will spread underground. So mowing is not necessarily effective. So you need to know the type of thistle that you're working with. But mowing can help, mulching will help, hand pulling and digging, removal of the vegetative growth. This is like what I told you with the field bindweed, where you take the shovel and you scrape the surface of the soil. We want to prevent this Canada thistle from being able to photosynthesize and put resources and carbohydrates into the root system. And then herbicides, multiple applications of herbicides on the Canada thistle are required to get it under control. And you can get it under control. It just takes several years to get it under control. So one thing I wanted to mention is we have a plant pest diagnostic lab that's opening tomorrow. We will run Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to noon. So if you have a weed that you need identified and you need some help knowing how to control it, you are more than welcome to bring that into our Master Gardener volunteers, and they will help you with some control options. And that will be through October 1st. And will run from 9 to noon. So, and it's at the USU Botanical Center in the Kaysville Education Building. So if there are any other questions, I'm sorry we went a little long, but if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening.
Sheridan, that was great. On this diagnostic lab, don't they also do that in Weber County at the Ogden Botanical Center?
They do, but they are not opening for another month. So we have a very increased demand this year, and so we decided to open a little bit earlier. So even if you're in Weber County this next month and you need to sneak in, I won't tell anyone. You won't get in trouble. Lori says, how do you take care of fairy ring? So fairy ring is actually a fungal problem. It's where we have mushrooms that come up in the lawn, and those mushrooms will come up and they'll feed on decomposing matter underneath the soil. So usually there's like a root from a tree or something like that underneath the soil. Fairy ring is not harmful. What it does is as it feeds, it spreads out, and you'll see the mushrooms start to spread out in a larger circle. And behind those mushrooms, you'll see a flush of green growth behind it. And that's just because as that organic matter breaks down, as the fungus breaks down that organic matter, it releases nutrients. And right behind that ring, you'll see an uptick in nitrogen and phosphorus and some of these other nutrients that are in the soil. So there's not a lot that you can do for fairy ring, but let it run its course. You can go out and pick the mushrooms off, but not much that you can do other than that. Okay.
That might be it.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, which is kind of surprising. So hopefully we answered all of them. Let's see, there is a hand up. Sandy, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. And Kim, also, if you have a question. Let's see. I can allow them to talk. David, do you usually let people do that? Sandy and Kim, I gave you the opportunity to talk if you need to unmute and ask.
Yes. Is this recorded so we can watch the rest of it later and go and take notes?
Yeah, it's recorded. It is recorded, and I sent David over the PDF version as well. So that will have like the table with all of the chemicals on it, all of that kind of stuff.
Oh, wonderful. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
On that the same place where you registered for the class, just at the top of that registration page, you'll see the links to where you can find the PowerPoint presentation, just the slides, as well as the video recording.
Yeah, I'd like to see both. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kim, go ahead and talk. You should be able to unmute.
Now can you hear me?
Yep, now I can hear you.
Okay, great. I grow goat heads out here that are like as big as walnuts. I think they probably crossbred with my walnut tree. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, I appreciate you guys doing this class.
Sure.
It's gonna be an interesting year.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Those goat heads, you know, even if they crossbred with your walnuts, you should be able to take care of them with some of those things we talked about, those Preemergents. Get out there with a shovel when they're young and just kind of chop them off. I think it will help you. So.
And then I make everybody, all my grandkids come out in their flip-flops and we just kind of
do
the yard and then scrape everything into the garbage can or discard the flip-flops and go from there.
You mean
Yep, that works out too.
Anyway, thanks again.
You're so welcome. All right.
Well, I think that may be all the questions. Thank you, Sheridan. We
great.
really appreciate your time tonight and sharing your knowledge. And this is very timely for many. I mean, the temperatures are going to start warming up here in April into May, and you'll see weeds coming like crazy. So get after it, right?
Yep, for sure. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Have a good night.
You too. We'll see ya.